I'll try and be as quick as possible, although I do run the risk of speaking too quickly, as I was reminded yesterday, and if I reach my cruising speed, I may become unintelligible. So please don't hesitate to stop me and slow me down. I do appreciate it if you do. This is going to be a story about a journey that is related to the work that we do with government, with the University of Melbourne. It began in 1996. The centre was created as a consequence of a promise made in about 10 years previously by the Howard government in Australia, who got into some trouble with some of their stakeholders, farmers, who were under the impression that international trade agreements were going to let floods of New Zealand apples and other dreadful products into our benighted country, and these products were cheaper and, one might argue, better in some regards than our own products, and therefore some of our farmers didn't particularly like the prospect, and there was all kinds of political debates, and one of these salves was to set up money for a centre of excellence devoted to biosecurity, and we put up our hand for that and got the job. And we were introduced to government as a university group who was going to do things for them, and their reaction was, "Who the blazes are you?" And some verbatim quotes in the first year of our interaction was, "You don't know anything about biosecurity," or "Mark, there is nothing that you can do that will make my life any easier." These are from the senior scientists with whom we were going to work for the next 7 years in robust scientific inquiry. It wasn't a warm reception. They looked at us and thought, "God, we have to put up with these people." We were foisted on them as outsiders. Now, the government's view of biosecurity is that this island, and we want to protect it. We have a particular image in terms of the saleability of the products, of being clean and green, and we don't use very many insecticides or pesticides relative to a lot of other places, and this whole idea of Fortress Australia is an important thing, and agriculture is still an important thing in our economy. It's governed, of course, by the World Trade Organization and its many statutes, the IPPC, the OIE, and Codex about food, plants and animals. These codes determine what we're supposed to do, and Australia has been taken to the World Trade Organization more often and has lost more frequently than any other country on Earth. And we're taken there on the back of various claims that we make and on the back of the science of biosecurity. Typically the grounds on which we might, a decision to allow or disallow a product to be transported between two countries, the decision is based upon an interpretation of the science. So, there are standards, and each country is allowed to create its own protocols, but one of the things written into the provisions is that each country can set its own level of protection. And Australia provides a very high level, or a high level of sanitary and phytosanitary protection aimed at reducing risk to a very low level, but not zero. Okay, that's the context. That's the social fabric within which we were doing our work. We're a bunch of ecologists, botanists, zoologists interested in the kinds of impacts that invasive species might have on the Australian environment and on its economy, and the kinds of impacts that zoonotics and pests and diseases might have on human health, as it turns out. The department uses a protocol that aspires to be risk-based, and it has some scientific tools to achieve those goals. So we set up a centre of excellence. It was composed of it has a budget of about $3 million a year. It has 15, 20 people, 25 people. It is also a system that reached out to many other institutions to get the work done. So we contacted the CSIRO, other universities, other research providers to implement things that we thought biosecurity needed. That worked in the way of a lot of science. We were thrown into a context and we thought, well, we think they need spatial analysis. And we think they need better ways of understanding uncertainty. And we think they need a more transparent way of doing the arithmetic that's sitting behind these risk matrices. Because that seems to us to be scientifically plausible and reasonable, and they want to be more scientific and more credible, so we'll help them. A sort of a paternalistic view of what science is towards government. And of course, we set up some structures for this, and a scientific advisory panel, projects approved by the Secretariat. So we came up with a list of ideas, We sent them into government, and government would say, yes, I like this one, and I like this one, and I like this one, I don't like that one, and I don't like that one, and we would negotiate about the content, and then we would go away and do the work and bring it back as a report, and they would say, that's very nice, and stick it on the shelf. And our work for the first 3 years was essentially ignored. We kept producing papers. We still had graduate students and postdoctoral fellows, and the metaphor was, before we started this work, we had a lab with 20 people, and after 3 years, we still had a lab and 20 people, and we were still producing as many papers, and they were having about the same level of influence. The reason that we got into this work was because I'd spent the first 15 years of my research career writing models. And we wrote models for all kinds of things, for threatened species and for managing ecosystems and in all kinds of contexts, and for forestry and for power generators and for miners, all kinds of contexts in which there was a need for a conservation biologist to write a model. And we wrote these models, and we wrote drop-down menus and help screens and manuals, and we did trials, and we put it onto their computers, and we put their hands over the keyboards, and they still didn't use them. And it was just a waste of time. It was a spectacular, soul-destroying waste of time. Although it was fun academically, and we wrote cute models and intellectually interesting, but it didn't do anything for anybody or anything that we could tell. So the idea behind putting our hand up and wanting to get involved in biosecurity was, I remember discussing this with Hugh Possingham at the time. We wanted to get involved with these agencies to try and make a difference. And so that was the attempt, and after 3 years, we really weren't. And I remember having a wonderful conversation with a couple of senior bureaucrats from the Australian government. We sat down at dinner, literally at dinner, with a couple of people who are still my friends, and we had that awkward conversation that says, so this isn't working for me, is it working for you? And you get the awkward pause. No, it's not really working for me either. Should we try again? That whole I'm sure you've all been through it, and slightly different circumstances. So and they said, well, look, no, it's not working for us either, but we've been thinking about this, and we have a plan. We want to do this differently. We want to suggest to you a way of operating that would work for us, but you have to buy into it. And we need to go away and have a think about it. We had, for the first 3 years, experienced a culture clash, and some of these things emerged in the conversations over the last couple of days. They didn't trust us. They did not trust where we came from, what we knew, that it was useful, and that we weren't going to use it to harm the department. We would get on the phone and talk to our friends in a newspaper or in the press and say, guess what they're doing? Oh my God, aren't they silly? And thereby engender change. And that's not the way they wanted to change. They don't want to be embarrassed. They don't want to upset the minister. In fact, that's their job not to upset the minister. They have different scientific cultures. There were silos within departments. We anticipated that, but they have different levels of tolerance for deliverables. We gave projects to university partners, and 1 in 10 of these projects that people simply didn't deliver. The postdoc would, after a year and a half, would just get a job somewhere else and not hand anything in. And you ring them up and say, so where's that report? And they go, oh, I've got another job. And I want to reach down the phone and throttle them, but in an academic environment, it's kind of okay not to deliver every now and then. But in other commercial or professional environments, it's not okay. It's not okay at all. Even though we anticipated that this would happen, and we explained to the board and our friends in government that occasionally there would be non-delivery, we'd write a contract, we'd get a proposal, they're waiting for the result, and nothing came. And well, where is it? What do you mean they're not going to send it to me? Did we give them any money? Well, yes, we did. Well, what's happened? They have different... a draft to a government officer is something that in a university environment is pre-publication copy. The difference in attitude to a draft is a very different thing. I would send them things and they would say, this looks very unprofessional. It's a draft, I would say. And they would say, well, that's not a draft to me, this is a mess. And so we had to change the way in which we thought about drafts and what we would communicate and when we communicated it. We had to think about how we dressed. I now have, I've got a cupboard full of suits, some rather nice suits. the way in which you use the forms of address in emails, who you copy and who you don't copy. One of the substantive things I learned was that government officers breathe information. It's like oxygen. And it works on networks of trust, of people with whom you share common values and you share information. And I learned that lesson early and began to copy in people on just about every email I generated, a subset of people with whom I wanted to build a relationship. And other things as well. People in government turn over much faster than people in universities. We're much, much more stable than they are, and so on. So the idea was, so we had lots of academic success. Jane Earlith we decided they needed spatial models. Jane Earlith started building spatial models. She's famous around the world for spatial models. She's fabulous. These models work. And does the government use them? No. They don't solve a problem that government currently has. They solve lots of other problems, but none that this department needed solved. We talked about offsetting protocols. We talked about imprecise probabilities and interval arithmetic. We developed protocols for multi-criteria decision analysis and a community of practice in this, and Hugh talked about this yesterday. None of these things found a home in this department. They were a waste of time, even though they were academically successful and interesting and creative and valuable. They weren't useful. There were things that, on the flip side, were academically disastrous and yet were successful in a regulatory environment. Instead of creating spatial models, some of our friends developed a tool which they labelled Multicriteria Analysis Shell, just a series of data layers, and that's all. It doesn't do anything. So it has no academic content whatsoever, but it's immensely useful because you have data layers and you can combine them to do stuff if you want. Anyway, we went back and said, okay, we've got to try and fix this thing. We've got to try and fix these problems. So we reworked the relationship following dinner and wine, champagne. We set up a steering committee that was composed of senior executives in the department. Deputy Secretary, First Assistant Secretaries and Assistant Secretaries. This is a trivial amount of money for them, but we said, we want you to decide what the projects are. You have to decide. So they had to delve into their departments and divisions and say, okay, what do we need doing? What is actually causing us grief? They sent us a list of projects. We have a science committee that says, well, no, this isn't really credible science, and this is business as usual. This is not sufficiently challenging. So we could reject projects on the grounds that they weren't meritorious, but that was the only ground upon which we could reject them. And everything else we did. And it sent us in to places we had no business being. We started to develop software to do horizon scanning, and Bonnie Wintle mentioned that on the first talk a couple of days ago. The IBIS software that's scanned, it's looking in your phone as we speak for cue words about biosecurity that will alert our Australian government to the fact that she may be intending to send something like foot and mouth disease to New Zealand, and we want to know ahead of time. So if you feel your phone moving, it's us looking. We got involved in other kinds of projects. In fact, the stuff that led us to getting involved in expert judgment, which is now one of our main research agendas, was because of the fractious nature of the World Trade Organization. We set up a board and joint responsibility for delivery. There is a person in the Department of Agriculture who is co-responsible with a university scientist for delivery of the product. So if the university person doesn't deliver, the government department person does. And it's on their annual appraisal. Here are the projects for which you are responsible. Now, did you deliver them? And so they have a motivation, an incentive to get this work done and get it done well. Each project has a sponsor, so that if there's some logjam with data or availability of something or other, this senior executive, at least a first assistant secretary, will sponsor the project and solve problems around access to data and similar things. We didn't sign a non-disclosure clause. We said no. We can talk to whom we want, when we want, about whatever we want. You're going to have to trust us. This was part of the quid pro quo of forming this new relationship. You decide the projects, but we're not going to, we are a public university, we're going to behave like one. If we've got some crazy person who wants to speak to the press, then that's what they're going to do. You're going to have to live with that. And in fact, it's never happened. They have learned to trust us because we are trustworthy. Anyway, so now we have projects that generate things that are both interesting and worthwhile in a scientific sense and that are valuable to this department, that they use. A method for distributing their surveillance effort so they find more with less effort and they find the more of the stuff that matters. This used to be determined by political priorities. They would go and look at things like polished white rice or green beans because some particular person had got this up in the newspaper as a visible issue, and now we don't do that. We do it much more sensibly and much more efficiently. We now scan. We can scan locations, we can scan ports, for example, and look at failure rates and allocate our resources accordingly. We can scan individuals. If you come into the airports now in Australia, you're much less likely to be frisked by some burly and unpleasant quarantine officer because we are profiling as people come in through the border. It's something that we didn't used to do. We have software that scans, as I mentioned. It generates publications and it generates outcomes that mean that we have been able to intercept things that otherwise would have arrived on our shores, and we can demonstrate the point at which we were able to intercept those things. We have protocols for getting the best out of experts, and some of you experienced a little bit of that yesterday. We have inculcated in the department the use of particular tools. We showed them about BES nets in about 2009 or 2010, and they use these tools routinely now as a way of structuring and solving problems. So, the bottom line was that in order to make this relationship work, we had to model our interactions around the kinds of things that make relationships work between people, between individuals. That is, we wanted to build a governance system that builds trust between institutions, between a university and a federal government department. And this is about transparency and trust. It's about reciprocity. It's about shared values. And it's about common goals. And the institutional arrangements mean that if I get hit by a bus and my friends in the government go and join another department, that the relationship between the institutions will persist. And that I believe we have created. And as a consequence, we have very senior public servants very interested in exactly what we do. They're waiting for our reports to land on their desks so that they can use them. And our work is used. So we are now making a difference of the kind that allows us to intercept things that otherwise would have arrived. We have changed Andrew Robinson, the Deputy Director, he's a statistician. His work on the inspection systems has qualitatively changed the behaviours of 3,500 inspectors at the borders of Australian borders. And that's the sort of thing that we had aspired to do when we began, but it took a cultural change to achieve it. I do think this model, this shared governance model, is replicable. We could use it in other circumstances, in other places, to do similar work on behalf of the environment. And so I'd recommend it to you. Thank you. Oh, thanks.
Thank you, Mark. Any questions? We've got one over there and then one down here.
Oh. Thank you, Mark. That's very interesting. Jake Bicknell, University of Kent, Dice. I wonder whether any of your software detected Johnny Depp's dogs, and whether, going back to a marketing question, whether the profile of that story actually helped the implementation of biosecurity in Australia.
Oh, Johnny Depp's dogs. Well, I think Johnny Depp's dogs really enhanced the behaviour of that minister who is now the Deputy Prime Minister. Johnny Depp's characterisation of him as, his disparaging characterisation of him was actually, because it's Australia, was seen as a mark of reverence, and therefore he was elevated in our esteem. I think Johnny Depp misread the Australian psyche completely. And it did indeed enhance biosecurity's profile, and it was generally a positive thing.
Excellent.
It's a funny country, what can I say?
Thank you, it certainly is. My question was around the types of people who helped you make that cultural change, and whether in either officially or in an unofficial capacity, the sorts of types of people who you found most useful either unexpectedly or expectedly, and what sort of skills they brought to the table you may not have had?
That's such an interesting thing. There are two kinds. There are the people in the university and the people in government. And the people in government, I think, really did lead us to cross the bridge. We had to cross the bridge, but they showed us the way. They were mature, devoted, smart public servants who wanted to do public good. And they exist. These humans exist. As I learned, I had this naive, cynical view of public servants, and there's this other kind. And they're charming and they're wonderful to work with, and they showed us how to behave and how to work, and suggested this model to us. Then we had to sell it to the university, and we lost several good people. People who looked at this and said, Mark, this is fine work, but I don't want to do it. Because there are some tough guys in government as well, people who are resistant and rather jaded and tough to work with. And they said, I don't want to bash heads with these people anymore. It's just too much trouble. I just want to do my thing in my little closeted environment. So we lost some really good people I had great hopes for, who said, no, I don't want to do this. We also had to lose some people from government who were just too jaded to work with us, and they no longer work in that department. So yeah, there were some changes to accommodate this new relationship, and it took people on both sides who wanted to do this.
There's another one over here. It's very busy over here, Mike.
Yeah, cluster. Clive Mitchell from Scottish Natural Heritage. So I work for a government agency, and relationships of trust are hugely important between ministers and agencies. And just following up on that theme of culture, and you said that trust was hugely important. I wondered what changes you yourself had to make to build that trust, particularly in terms of understanding the risks that ministers are exposed to and the politics of their day-to-day existence, and how that related to your framing and development of trust.
We lived such different lives to our friends in government that we had to learn how they work, and that was part of crossing the bridge, I guess. I didn't own a mobile phone before I started, and my friend in government, he bought me one. He said, "Take this, use this." Seriously, it was very funny. I think it depended on initially on the personal relationship that I formed with a government bureaucrat, but we wanted to build something that would outlive us, and it was his vision that led to this institutional arrangement. I don't know if that answers your question quite. I don't want to speak for too long. I could speak for a day. Perhaps we should follow up afterwards. Yeah.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you for the questions, and thank you again to Mark.
Thank you very much.